Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm really pleased to welcome Alan Davenport as today's presenter. Alan's the ELT consultant for the ASEAN region at Cambridge University Press. He's been actively involved in ELT for more than 10 years as a teacher, teacher trainer, academic administrator and testing examiner. He's been a featured speaker at conferences and programs around Asia and the Middle East, and his professional interests include developing creativity in the classroom and the development of non-standard forms of English with respect to their impacts on language assessment. So, over to you.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you everybody for joining today. I know that we're all teachers here, and even though that sometimes we say these webinars are no cost, I know how precious your time is. So I really appreciate you giving me some of yours. All right, so without any further ado, I think we should just jump right in. And I want to start just by making sure, basically, that we understand what I'm talking about when I say the IELTS. And what this is, of course, is the International English Language Testing System. And it is an examination that tries to measure does measure the language proficiency for people who are looking to study or work in a country that it uses English as its first language. The ratings for the for the candidates are given, on a band of 0 to 9, with general ideas of what each score represents. And I think that this is important for us to understand at first because it is a rating type examination. It's not an examination that a student can pass or fail. Usually there is an ideal band score that students are trying to achieve. And so that scaling of the IELTS test itself is important to understand that way. In this scenario, for these webinars that I'm going to be presenting on, I'm really going to be focusing on either the academic or general training modules of the IELTS. Recently, there's been a new development of the IELTS Life Skills exam, and this set of webinars won't be dealing with that. And so really, for what I want to get across, I think that the idea of using these authentic practice tests and the ideas that I'm doing has to do with the academic or general training modules. And I'm not going to go into any further detail really about what the IELTS test is. You can see the link here on this slide in case that you want more information on the exam itself. But I am operating this under the kind of assumptions that people are generally familiar with the IELTS exam, as is already. So why this webinar? Why did I want to do this? And I think it's really because when I was an administrator for a private language school and I was observing teachers, especially teachers of IELTS classes, I noticed that there were kind of 3 different patterns of teachers that I saw in IELTS classes. There were those who never brought in the authentic practice tests and kind of stuck to whatever course material we had chosen to use. Quite the opposite of that, I think we had a few teachers who would bring in authentic practice tests or practice tests every day into their IELTS classes, trying to get students familiar with the testing part of the class. And then the third type, of course, were teachers who tried to find a balance in that. And each of those 3 types of classes used authentic practice tests differently, if at all. And I want to make it clear that there's benefit to all 3 types of those IELTS classes. In fact, if there's a lot of distance between the language level that the learner is at and the band score that they are trying to achieve, then I think that perhaps, focusing on the language and not bringing in authentic practice tests could make sense. Or if learners in most of these classes already have a good level of English, maybe even above the level that the band score wants to be, then it does make sense to increase the amount of practice testing in the class. But what I really wanted to focus on here was ways of blending in these authentic practice tests into most of our practice. And I think it's also important for me to point out that this webinar is not really specifically going to be laying out what is the correct method or what is a good method for giving practice tests as practice in a class. And Cambridge has already done a very good webinar, which I think they'll put a link to in the chat room, that was done by Gary Anderson, that focused on a lot of things to really think about if we want to bring in practice tests as pure practice. But what I really wanted to do was kind of show how these practice tests could perhaps get a little bit more off the page, and how we could use these practice tests for more than just mere practice testing in the classrooms. And I'm reminded of something that was told to me by a former supervisor of mine, that practice does make perfect as long as we are practicing the correct way. And again, there is no one correct way, of course, of using practice tests. But I think when we talk about assessment in general, or when we talk about this idea of helping our learners to achieve their goal, especially if that goal is a high stakes exam, then we can use these for more than just testing their progress. We can use them to get feedback about their learning, about the language and how it relates with the authentic practice material that they're doing, and to kind of see if they're ready even for the exam or not. So this is kind of the basic between it. Now, here's an idea. And it's an idea that I had when I was in an IELTS, when I was teaching an IELTS class here in Thailand, actually. And I wondered if, when we taught an IELTS course, would it be a good idea that in addition to a course book, because my program used course material, that all the students in the course were given the same authentic practice test materials to use. And it was a bit of an experiment that I wanted to go on. And it was something that really opened my eyes to how using these tests in a different way really could be beneficial to our learners. And what I actually did was for each of the students that were in my course, I would recommend that instead of a normal course workbook, that we had the IELTS course book based on the level that the students were having. In my case, we were using Objective IELTS Intermediate, but also bringing in and making sure that they were using the same set of IELTS authentic practice test materials. And in this case, it was IELTS Book 8, just because that's what most of the students had already and hadn't opened. And it was a grand experiment, and I was so pleased with the results that I wanted to share it, basically, with everyone here in this series of webinars. So I like this instead of a workbook, and it really worked for my students for a number of reasons. One, it really kept a lot of the practice tests and the ways that they were engaged with the IELTS test itself all in one place. Beforehand, when I was bringing in separate materials and trying to find resources and printing off things, we'd have our course book, but my students would also have, basically an incredibly thick binder of materials that they had compiled, that I had compiled and for them. And it just really became difficult to organize, difficult to keep track of. I don't know if any of you have had that experience as well, where if you wanted to go back and maybe refer back to a practice test that they had taken 2 weeks ago, then it took time for all the learners to find that material that they had with them, or to see, if they had even remembered to bring it with them. So one of the things that doing this, when we had the course book and a notebook and just the book of the authentic practice tests, it really made the organization of class more intentional, more focused. Another thing that I found is that it allowed us to show some systematic progression instead of just random sampling. And by that, what I mean is, when we would talk about a type of task, in a test folder in Objective IELTS, if it was true, false, not given, or a listening task, we could actually go and look at what that looked like in the authentic practice test material, instead of just waiting for it to come up because we were going to give test 1 out of the book. So this way, what I'm trying to say is, if we had practiced an exam type from the course book, we could then go and find that exact exam type, or that task type, in the authentic practice test exam itself, and really exploit it for all it was worth. The other thing that I liked as well is being able to compare between 2 different sets of authentic practice tests. Where this really became evident to me was in the writing section, actually, where students could look at and see that here was a line graph and here was a pie chart. In what ways would I tackle this task 1 answer the same, and what ways is it different? And then I realized that these same comparisons across tests happened in all the skills: listening, reading, and speaking itself. And then finally, one that I do feel the need to say is, it is also legal. There is fair use of photocopying, but this was a way of just making sure that my language school, which was affiliated with a government program, was above board and not violating any copyright issues or doing anything unethical or illegal. The last thing that I would say, which was a big eye-opener for me, was that it was not important that students had the latest version of the authentic practice tests. And as long as the tests were authentic, in some ways, we even found some advantages to using some of the materials that weren't the most up-to-date. For example, in this case, IELTS 9 had already come out, but we were still using IELTS 8. And what we had found was that, to be quite honest, that in the stores, IELTS 8 was less expensive than IELTS 9 at that time. So it became more cost effective. There were some bookstores in my area that were selling IELTS 7 and 8 together as a bundle. So, and then the last thing we would find is that some students, before they had joined the class, had naturally, just on their own, bought IELTS 9 themselves and had started working through it. So in this case, for us, even though IELTS Book 9 of the authentic practice tests were out, we decided to continue using IELTS Book 8 for those reasons, and it still had worth and value. So here's kind of the crux of what I want to go through. And when I say, I'm seeing a lot in the comments of APT, and when I say authentic practice tests, this is the books that I think we're familiar with, that give the practice papers from Cambridge. We usually refer to them as Cambridge IELTS 4, IELTS 5, IELTS 6. So if you see on my slides APT, I do mean authentic practice test. And it's important for me to point out that they're authentic because, they go through the same process of being developed as the IELTS tests that students take when they sit the examination. But back to the main part, how can we use them as more than just a test? Well, I'm hoping that this will inspire you to think of how we can use tests. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, but these are just activities that I have used. they're just the tip of the iceberg. I'm hoping to give you some inspiration that can make you look at how to possibly use them in a different way. When we first started doing this, some of the teachers that are in my school were a little bit worried that if we had used the practice tests in more of a practice mode going through this, then does it take away their benefit of, having the actual practice test as test experience taken away? And we didn't find that. We found that actually it could be rewarding for our students because, if we do this, if we use the practice tests in sort of a practicing mode the right way and give it enough spacing and give it enough time, there's still a chance for us to go back and use those same tests again as practice testing in a test condition sort of environment. And so we didn't find that there was any negative. Students weren't just memorizing the answers and going from their memory. They were engaging in the test a different way, using the skills and the language that we had taught. It wasn't an idea, or it wasn't a situation where they were just remembering that 13, 14, 15 were true and then false and then not given, so they just repeated what they knew from memory. And I think that comes from having different tests and the way that we pick and choose what we do at a given time, as opposed to giving them the full test under test conditions. And I think this shows even with what we try to do here at Cambridge University Press, for example, with our test bank program, which is our online practice testing module, which lets learners take the test in both a practice mode and a test mode. And I think that concept can go even in our face-to-face teaching as well. So just to recap, as I say on the end, this is given as hopeful inspiration to try out other things with other question types and to hopefully, as we like to say sometimes, get the tests off the page. So this webinar, I do want to focus on reading. And this is a page from our newest course book, IELTS 11. I'll be using different pages from different authentic practice test books. But I think that the first thing that we can do when we give them a full book as a kind of a workbook is we can show students the features of the reading test, or any test really, more inductively. It meant more for my students to be able to talk about the test and how it's structured while looking at different examples of it than just by giving them the information the first day of class by saying, the reading test has 40 questions in 3 sections. So it really gives them a practical thing to look at. And I would have students not just focus on what the passages look like, but it gave us time to look at the directions themselves so that they were familiar with what it would say on each test. You should spend about 20 minutes, questions 1 to 13. And these are things that I think sometimes we may take for granted, or at least I know I took it for granted at times, because I just assumed, or I had forgotten, that students may not be familiar with this. So it allowed me to slow my teaching down and really concentrate on something like test familiarization. So here's what I did for the first class that I taught. You can choose any authentic practice test book. And I divided my students into groups. So I would have 4 groups of students. If you have larger classes, you could have 8 groups, however you'd want to divide it. And I would have one group of students look at the reading test 1. I would have another group of students look at the reading test in test number 2. If you're familiar with the Cambridge books, you'll be aware that there are 4 practice tests in each in each book itself. So having each student or each group look at a different practice test and then having them look and answer the questions themselves. How many different texts are there in your reading section? How many questions total does it ask? How many questions are there in each section? And this gives them really a chance to look at what's the same and what's different. And they would find out that every exam had 3 sections, each section asking for that suggests you should spend 20 minutes on it, for a total of 1 hour for the reading test. That each reading test had 40 questions. But also that in each section, it may not be the same number of questions in each section. For example, on some tests, the first text would have questions 1 to 14. And on another one, it would be 1 to 13, so that they can see that there will be one text that will have 14 questions, one that will have 13, and then the final one that will have 13, but it may not be in the same order. So they can really look at what is to be expected and how each exam is the same and might be a little bit different. And then we could also ask them to put in their own words what types of questions that they see on the exam. They would say multiple choice, fill in the blank, matching, so that we know what question types that they were already familiar with. And it was also a time for us to point out features, because we would inevitably have students who would say, I see true, false. And we could point out that, well, actually on the IELTS exams, you're not seeing true, false. It's true, false, not given. And we can kind of start with that structure of the test on the first day, so that they can see how the testing itself works. And again, instead of us just giving them the information and telling them what kind of question types there are, they can inductively get a feel for it themselves. Another thing that we found, or that I found, was when we took it by section, when we could really link the language that they were learning in the classes to the practice tests themselves. And I'd like to give you an example real quick. So this comes from an authentic IELTS practice test, and it's a type of question. And let's look at the question type. Now, it says match each statement with each person, right? I mean, with each correct person, A to E. And again, it's not just about knowing that they can use any letter more than once. It's not just about test skills, but it's also about saying, what would I expect if I'm matching what these statements are to what somebody else has, or to what it says in the text? Let me try to clarify that a bit. We could let our students know that this type of question was trying to find out who said what. You know, when it's saying match each statement with the correct person, we're talking about who said what. So I'd like for you to quickly think of the language involved in reporting what others have said, in paraphrasing. If we were doing that, what kind of language would you expect to hear, or would you expect to see? And go ahead and type a few things in the chat box if you don't mind, if we're doing paraphrasing. Reported speech, exactly. And this is really where it could tie in the language we were learning, even in IELTS courses, to showing what it really looks like in the class. So here's another reading. This is from that reading, Lost for Words, and this is just a page. And very quickly, I'd like for you to scan. And I want you, if it's all right, to try to find the names Mark Pagel, Michael Kraus, and Nicholas Ostler. And I will give you about 30 seconds to look and find it. And if you think you found all 3, you can just type yes in the box. But we'll give you 30 seconds to have a look and use your scanning skills. the names Mark Pagel, Michael Kraus, and Nicholas Ostler. You should be able to find all three. About 5 seconds left. Fantastic. Thank you all for your presentation, or for your participation. Thank you. Now, I'd like for you to find the reporting verbs or the markers around these names. There are the three names you should have found. Can you find the reporting verbs? And again, I might even elicit with classes what I'd expect to see. Things says, claims, states, and reporting verbs, and also markers, things like according to, exactly. Great. People are really finding according to, says. All right. Let's see if you found the same ones I did. Here's what I found. The says before Mark Pagel, the according to before Michael Kraus. But again, if I look at Nicholas Ostler, I have 2 times that the word says comes up right before his name, and also, he says. And I think this is important for students because my students who are at the IELTS band 5.5 or 6, felt that reporting verbs would almost always come after the proper noun themselves, or they wouldn't look at the linking, or just getting them to see that second says that's associated with Nicholas Ostler. This is what I mean about connecting the language with the actual testing itself. So this is what the first one that we found said. At the moment, we are heading for about 3 or 4 languages, ... I'll give you a chance to read this, and then I want you to tell me on 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 in the actual practice test below, which one of these is the best paraphrase for this example of the reported speech. You have about 20 seconds. All right, I get a few responses. Most aren't falling for my trick. The answer really is that none of these are a good paraphrase. And in fact, this doesn't connect with any of these paraphrases. And this again is where I'm going beyond just the test skills, to even though that we've looked at the reported speech and we found a paraphrase, that it may not be related exactly to what the language is on the test, and we can go and look and examine why not, and try to teach our students not to force answers that are there when they're not there, which for my students at least was an important skill. It was tricky, Olga. I see you writing that. Here's one that I promise actually does have an answer. Now here's another one. Says Nicholas Ostler of Britain's Foundation for Endangered Languages. And Nicholas Ostler is C. This one I promise has an answer. Which one would you think it is? 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9? A wide variety of answers already between 9 and 8. Yes, I will come clean and say, sometimes when I take IELTS practice tests myself just to see how I do, I don't always get 40 out of 40 correct on the reading myself. So let's see what the answer was. And again, a lot of times when we bring in the authentic practice test, this is where we leave it. But now we can discuss why. We could talk to our students after they know this is the answer. Why is this the paraphrase? And when we say, when the next generation reaches their teens, we can talk about that being young people and the established way of life being synonyms for tradition. So instead of just giving it and checking the answers, looking at the way that the language itself works in this test. So that's an example of finding the language, seeing how it relates to the test, and explaining that link itself. And doing this, even though it's slower than the time that the students will have on the test to actually take it itself, I think that it still builds up a method, a way of getting the feel for the language being tested so that we can give them this idea, and hopefully the fluency will come later, and not expecting them just to be able to do everything and understand under time right away. And again, that's from IELTS book 4, one of our older sort of authentic practice test books, but still very relevant, still very useful in the way to connect it. In a similar way, I like to get really creative with heading matching. My students had a huge problem with heading matching. And I think the reason why is because, heading matching really is a search for the main idea. And my students seem to understand the basic concept of the main idea. But their ideas of what they had been taught maybe previously in their English classes was the main idea is always the topic sentence of the paragraph. It's always the first sentence. And when we talked about the heading matching was really a search for the main idea, that some confusion still happened. So here's just one way that I tried to make heading matching more meaningful with the language and practice testing with my classes. And I wouldn't worry about the actual matching of the headings right away. What I would do is I would have my students turn to just the list of headings themselves, and I would project the paragraphs one at a time on the whiteboard. So in this case, here's the first paragraph of the text that this list of headings came from. And I'll give you just about 30 to 45 seconds. And if you feel brave and you want to type it into the text box, you can. If you just want to wait for the answer, that's okay as well. But which heading do you think goes with this paragraph? Exactly. It is 9. And a lot of students would get this because of, the words that they see that are the same. But, this is the whole paragraph. And it seems that the heading takes up a lot of, it's 3 sentences long, and the heading really hits all 3 of those sentences. And it's not important that our students know what hypothetico-deductive means. I don't think that I would be able to explain it myself, quite honestly. But this is an idea of, getting them to understand the main idea. And then we could do it again with this one. Now, what I've done with this paragraph is I've taken the first 2 sentences and the last sentence from one of the paragraphs from the text. It was a rather long paragraph, but I wanted to just see if using the first the second, and the last if the students could get a general idea of what the main idea is. Right? Most people are saying 4, and indeed 4 is the answer. And when I could do this with my students, it would allow them to focus on the main idea of each paragraph and seeing how it could be displayed in the IELTS. You know, when, like I said before, when they're taught to find the main idea in their schools, they've a lot of times been told that it's the first sentence. But many times on the IELTS exam, it could be the first sentence or the second sentence or the last sentence, or even kind of inferred through the paragraph itself. The reason this is important is because if I didn't do this, then students, at least my students again, would try to find these sorts of associations, where this one, the list of headings, the Crick and Watson approach to research, and they'd look in paragraph G, and it would say Crick and Watson, and the word research is somewhere in there, so they would assume, you know, hooray, I found it, Crick and Watson, I've matched it to Crick and Watson. When really, this is not the correct answer. And getting them to be able to focus more on the beginning and the end, and looking to try to find the main idea in that way, and not just the detail or supporting ideas, we could have discussions of why one is not the correct answer, and in fact something else is. And in this case, you know, if we look at the ultimate sentence in this, from this point of view, scientific method may more usefully be thought of as a way of writing up research rather than as a way of carrying it out. That tends to go with the how research is done and how it is reported. And we can go further and look at how, when we look at the main idea and not the detail itself, that's how the heading matches goes. And it allowed my students, at least, to avoid some of the traps that the IELTS tries to trick people into selecting, because it focuses on detail. I didn't only just project. Sometimes I would put the headings on the walls. I would, you know, maybe photocopy those themselves and have students walk around and try to match in that way, so that it was more active in the class, because IELTS courses can sometimes be a little bit sit down, you know, courses. One thing that worked for me was I would remove the wrong answers, and I would just have the same number, or I'd have the correct headings and the correct paragraphs, and I would make somewhat of a pairing activity where half the class was given headings, half the classes were given paragraphs. Again, there were no incorrect answers, I had removed those, and having them try to find the people that matched up, and having the people who had a longer paragraph, you know, understand the main idea, and have the other people who had those headings try to match and describe what, you know, why they thought that they went together one at a time. And it made a very good active, you know, activity, much in the likes of our popular Who Said What, or not Who Said What, but the Find Someone Who activities that we do in more communicative classes, just for a bit of a break. And it also allowed us to analyze headings better and make sure that students were paying attention to words that were important. Like the words that I have boxed in red here in the list of headings. Students sometimes go too quickly over words like future, or like on number 6 here, find two opposing views in the same paragraph, or how the statue is made, so that they're focusing not just on the key words and matching those, but understanding what the IELTS itself is doing with heading matching and what main idea really looks like for them. Another thing that was very helpful for my students, and this is kind of my last technique, was something I called reverse keywords. And I would ask them when we were doing these practice tests not to mark on the tests themselves, but to record their answers and why in their notebook so we could do the practice test as a practice after the fact. And, you know, just so they'd also have practice writing their answers elsewhere like they have to do on the answer sheet. But here's what I mean with reverse keywords, and it's something that works with multiple choice and even with something like true, false, not given. So what I would do is I would, have them spend as much time as it would take to answer 14 to 19 with true, false, not given. And then we would check the answers just like we normally would do. And then I would ask them to tell me which paragraph they found the answers in. Again, I wouldn't have them circle in the book, but they'd say, oh, the answer to question 14 was in the first 2 paragraphs. The answer to question 16 was in the 4th, so that I knew that we could find it. But then to take it one step further, after we knew the answer, I would ask him what the keywords really were. So here was one of the true, false, not given. The Falkirk wheel has linked the Forth and Clyde Canal with the Union Canal for the first time in their history. And I found that if I asked my students to find the keywords just on their own, they would select too many of them, and they would usually select the ones in red of what they thought the keywords were. And then after we looked at what the answer was and where the answer was, and we see things that it says reconnecting, and we see things that says the 2 canals had been joined near the town of Falkirk, we can really look that one of the key words for true, false, not given, and this one was the first time. And I've seen it on authentic practice tests and IELTS, my students missing questions just because of something like simple tense, where it might say something like, the pyramids are covered in limestone, as true, false, not given. Whereas in the text itself, it would say the pyramids once were covered in limestone, where the key word itself isn't just pyramids and limestone, but it's about paying attention to the tense, the is versus was, or having them kind of get their radar up if they see something in the passive voice versus the active voice, so that they can identify that even though they found where it was in the text, that the language matches. And again, getting them used to the language and then developing that fluency with it so that they can be more confident with taking the practice tests later. And again, the same sort of concept, the weight of the gondolas varies according to the size of the boat being carried. When they look that, they find the sentence, the gondolas always weigh the same, then we can look at what the key words were and getting them an idea of getting that feel for what keywords on the IELTS are. Not just weight and gondolas and boat, but these verbs that carry meaning as well. Varies and is and passive voice. So my whole point is this, that authentic practice tests can be more than just timed practice tests. And pure practice testing is important. There is a time and there is a place for it. But so is taking the time and getting the tests off the page and explaining to students not just how those question types work and which ones go in order and that's no more than 2 words and a number, but also how the language fits with what we've done. they can actually expand what's taught in the course books and be used to show how the language in that test features. So we get to see the features of the test and the language of the test. For example, that one that said first time in history. Using the authentic practice material, if it's authentic, even older authentic practice material as a workbook, gives them a chance to bridge that balance between the language that they're learning, those test skills that they're learning in the course book, and to see how it works in black and white. And again, having that practice test book as a workbook, along with just one other notebook that they can keep their writings and their notes in, gives us a chance to go back and investigate and revise as a class together later. So I hope I've shown you how techniques can go beyond just checking answers and telling why, and that you're inspired to use these books with reading for more than just, of sitting them down and timing them for 60 minutes and then checking the answers. I hope that I've shown you, given you some inspiration to create your own ideas of how to use these tests to bridge that gap. And again, our latest authentic practice test in our series that we have are IELTS 11. And I think it's important to know that we've done something new this year, and that instead of having academic and general training together in the same book, we've actually separated the books for this year. Whereas in IELTS 2 through 10, you're going to find that there's a general training addendum. And I think that this is important for our students who are taking the general training module to feel, that it's as important too, and that they're not just an afterthought. And again, we're also offering this available as Test Bank, which is an online version of practice testing that also comes with an LMS and a gradebook, so that teachers can focus and look at how students have responded to the tests in a practice mode, so that what we've talked about here with these things on paper can also be investigated in class if they choose to do it in an online mode as well. The idea that Test Bank gives a practice test mode and an authentic testing mode is fantastic, and it's brilliant, and it's a way that we can use this in classes to hopefully make our teaching more purposeful and more relevant. So those are just a few of my ideas for reading. And Alistair, if it's all right with you, we can turn it over to some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Alan. That was really interesting. Very much enjoyed that. So got a question from Judith Dermer, who teaches A1 and A2 learners who'll be taking the exam in about 10 weeks. Is there anything particular you have to recommend for them? Any variants on the techniques and ideas you've shared?
With A1 and A2 learners, for me, it depends on what their actual goal is and what score they're trying to achieve. One of the things that we can do when we're bringing in these techniques and connecting it is for them to understand that the authentic test itself is more difficult than probably what they're seeing in their course books, but to be able to focus on what they can get correct and what they might need to let go. For a lot of my students here in Thailand, some of them only needed to get a 4 or a 4.5 to get accepted into a pre-college program here in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And here, I think the idea is using these texts and these learner modes for them to be able to, one, understand that their goal is not perfection, that they don't need to get 40 out of 40 on the reading test to achieve their goals. And two, when we take these when we take it kind of section by section, that we can give them kind of a sense of their own timing and a sense of, when to move on, because I find with low-level learners, A1, A2, when they're taking the IELTS, especially reading, the biggest problem is that they spend way too much time on the first passage. Things on global multiple choice questions that ask them to summarize the whole passage, which sometimes a better technique for them is to just kind of take a guess on that one and move on to something that's more fill in the blank, where they can look at key words and have a better chance. So with that, I think that these skills give them a chance for test management and their own personal management while taking the test, and knowing what question types they can really focus on, that there's their strength, and which ones that can be, kind of let go.
Okay, thanks. Question now that it must be, I know the answer to, but it's good to announce this. So, Marina Pavlenko asks, are you planning to cover other parts of the exam in your webinars?
Yes, I think well, I don't think, I know we're planning on doing this in 4 parts. The first one here with reading, and then we'll cover writing and listening and speaking in separate other webinars. Again, using the techniques that I kind of developed with using the authentic practice tests in my own classroom. So I hope that means that you're interested in attending the ones in the future for everyone.
Yes, so thanks for that, Alan. And just let everyone know that the other sessions we should have up on our ELT events page very soon, so that you'll be able to sign up for those. A question now from Christine Sotro-Chandley, who asks, how do we help learners not to become overwhelmed or distracted in the IELTS tests?
I think the easiest answer for me to say is I don't know exactly. So I don't want to make it sound like I have a very good, exact technique that works every single time. I think the what I would look for in my practice if I was giving them practice tests is to figure out why they were getting distracted, or is it a lack of focus because they find the whole language too difficult? Is it that their reading fluency speed isn't high enough? We teach a lot of skimming and scanning, but there is still some reading that gets involved with the IELTS test as well. Is it the fact that they feel that that they don't understand exactly, that they can't use their own knowledge in tests, which sometimes happens with my students in my classes. They might know an answer because they're engineers and it's an engineering text, but it's not in there, and they get frustrated this way. So I think that before I can kind of answer that specifically, I would have a talk with the learners, and when you do practice testing in this way in a practice test mode and take it piece by piece, you can ask how they felt about that question type. Did they find it difficult to focus? And give them kind of that meta knowledge of their own learning strategies and how they felt, and letting them report to you their feelings and where that focus may have had, and being able to deal with it that way as a teacher. What I genuinely did find when we did this and took the time with the authentic practice test is students were a lot more open with not just their fears, but their successes and how they interacted, and what types of questions they found easier or more challenging, or even more so the ones they felt confident about, but the ones that they wind up missing anyway, because, like I said, with that main idea versus detail sort of response answer. So I'm sorry I can't give you definite techniques, but I think it depends on why is their distraction or the focus. Again, if it's that they don't have, high enough English level to understand the practice test itself, that's bringing in more language and more support. Sometimes it's identifying the reason why first, and that's about the best answer that I could give.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alan. I've had a couple of questions about vocabulary knowledge and the lack of it, and whether you've got any suggestions about whether you could use the tests to develop vocabulary learning, or does that need to be separate?
I think that these practice tests can be used in any way possible, even for vocabulary learning. What I find best for me in my practice is that the type of vocabulary learning that goes together is with collocation itself, and mainly paraphrasing, what they use as synonyms, what they use as antonyms. But even more crucial, the discourse markers that are found, especially in reading, the howevers, or the in as much as, or these markers that give examples or a positive forms, and the linguistic features themselves. Having said that as well, I haven't done this yet, but one thing I would be interested in doing is running, a couple of paragraphs through our English profile. And I don't know if you can put the English profile, vocabulary profile web address on their englishprofile.org and
Okay, I'll
seeing,
take a look now.
what language, might be needed to be addressed. But again, one of the skills of the IELTS as well is knowing which vocabulary they can kind of let go. What was that we had before? The theoretico, I forget exactly what it
Nice.
was, but hypothetico deductive. I wouldn't spend a lot of time with those words, but making sure that if it is something like they needed a 6.5, running it through and see what words on the test are at the B1, B2 level, through the English profile and vocabulary profile, and making sure that we can generate our own list of words in that way. That could be very useful and something I would do next time I'm in an IELTS classroom.
Okay, thanks. We've had a couple of people asking for recommendations of course books or support books for students. Any particular books you'd recommend?
Yes, and I'll first start by saying I promise this isn't my business card talking. I really believe in the practice materials that are done from Cambridge University Press, but I think the trick is matching them to what the students need. If I found that my students needed a lot more language development than the test itself, I think you can't go wrong with objective IELTS. If they kind of need a 50-50 blend of getting the knowledge about the test itself and increasing the language that's directly applied, they're close to the band score that they want. They just need a little bit of linguistic push. Then I would recommend complete IELTS, depending on the band level that they're hoping to get. And then our official Cambridge Guide to IELTS, if they already have a language level that's close to what you know that they're hoping to get, or even sometimes higher, you're not going to find any better about understanding how the test works, how the different question types work than the official Cambridge Guide to IELTS as well. So again, I would look at are the linguistic needs and kind of go in that order for my students. I've used a wide variety, but I found when I've focused on that, it provides a clear, consistent message. The other one as well is vocabulary for the IELTS. Like somebody asked, grammar is something that we can sometimes get inductively, and I see that students will, on their own, buy grammar books. But being able to bring in vocabulary for the IELTS, and we have two levels of that, and showing them the features of that, that's very helpful as well.
Okay, thanks. One final question from Rizwan Abari, who asks, how significant is the role of learners' own proficiency levels in maximizing the benefits gained from the tips and strategies you've been sharing with us?
I think it is important, but it's not important as to how proficient they are. I think it's important to how close their English level is matching the result that they want. So, for example, if it's an A1 or A2 student that's searching, that's hoping to get an IELTS band 4 or 5, that puts me in a different situation than the A1 or A2 student that comes into the language school saying, I'm taking the test in 2 weeks and I'm hoping to get a 7.5. And I don't know how it is in your parts of the world, but that certainly has happened to me at times in Thailand, and we get an oh dear. So I think that, the focus still, we are English teachers, language teachers first, and building up that language and getting them close. What I really like to do, though, with the practice test, the authentic practice test material, is just trying to show them that what we've learned about the test and the language we've learned in the course book is real and does apply to the actual exam that they're going to take. That it's not some abstract concept, but we can look at it with this authentic material and see how it applies with the exact type of course, the exam that they're going to take. So it's not about how good their English is, because again, the test is not something you pass or fail. It's the distance they are between what they hope to achieve and where they're at currently that I think raises that significance.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Alan. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in today's session. But before we go, I'd just like to let you all know about next week's webinar. So in our usual Tuesday afternoon slot in the UK, Susanna Reid and Leslie Kustaff will be joining us to share some steps to successful communication for young learners. You can sign up for that on our events page, and we'll share a link for you to sign up for that. In fact, Sarah very quickly, she's so efficient, already has in the chat. We'll also be letting you know in the next few days about the next set of webinars we've got coming up in the next month or so. So that will also be added to our events page in the next few days. Don't forget that your certificate of attendance will be sent out automatically next week, and you really don't need to email me about it. If you miss any of our webinars, we share the recordings on our YouTube channel and on our blog, so you can catch up. So thank you very much to my co-moderators, Sarah, Rebecca and Rob. Thank you particularly to Alan for a really interesting, informative webinar. I'm very pleased that you'll be coming back to do many more for us. And thank you everyone for attending, for being so engaged and for asking so many questions. Thanks very much everybody, and see you, I hope, very soon. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you all.